Good morning and welcome. On behalf of the Library of Congress and the Serial and Government Publications Division, I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Malia Walker. I'm a reference librarian in the newspaper and current periodical reading room. I'm very excited for today's presentation, Made at the Library, Gary Sarnoff's Team of Destiny and the 1924 Washington Senators. Gary Sarnoff is a writer and a historian. He is the author of 3 baseball history books, The Wrecking Crew of 33, the Washington Senators' Last American League Pennant, The Yankees' First Dynasty, Babe Ruth, Miller Huggins, and the Bronx Bombers of the 1920s, and most recently, the book he'll be telling us about today, Team of Destiny, Walter Johnson, Clark Griffith, Bucky Harris, and the 1924 Washington Senators. Gary is an active member of the Society of American Baseball Research and the Professional Football Research Association and speaks on baseball history throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. He has also been a researcher at the Library of Congress since 2005, almost 20 years. I've worked with Gary for many years in the newspaper and current periodical reading room, helping him to find newspapers for research, so I'm very excited to hear about his book. So please help me to welcome our speaker, Gary Sarnoff.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Malia. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Also, I want to say I appreciate the Library of Congress giving me this opportunity, and I appreciate all of you being here. As mentioned, I have authored 3 baseball history books, and I've done a lot of research for those 3 books. I visited libraries throughout the country, historical societies, and museums, but I've done the majority of my research here at the Library of Congress, without question. I'm a frequent visitor of the Library of Congress, as someone had told me this morning that I should just sleep here. But speaking of the Library of Congress, it was kind of interesting as I was doing research on the 1924 baseball season and the Washington Senators. It was interesting that for the first time, I came across something referenced the Library of Congress. A New York sports writer referenced a gallery of etchings and prints within the Library of Congress, and he compared one of the etchings to the current success of the 1924 Washington Senators. I'll get into that a little bit later, but I just want to say about the 1924 Senators, I always wanted to write this book because I always thought this was a great story. I always thought this was a wonderful story and a story that should be told, and I wanted the opportunity to tell the story. And I think it's a wonderful story for a few reasons. Number one reason is because it was such an underdog. I mean, they were totally unexpected to do anything that season. They weren't expected to be good. And if you know anything about the old Washington Senators, you know that they weren't very good, especially in the 1950s when the Yankees were winning pennants year after year in the World Series. And here were the Senators, usually finishing last or close to last place. So it was hard in the 1950s for anybody to believe that the Senators actually did it. And someone, in fact, told me that, yeah, I know the Senators beat out the Yankees. They beat the damn Yankees in the old musical, damn Yankees. No, it happened. I told him it happened. It happened in 1924. But I think above all, what makes this story so great is Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson was a Hall of Famer, a true gentleman who pitched his entire career for the Senators, usually for teams that weren't very good. He won over 400 games in his career, struck out over 3,000 batters. 110 career shutouts is still the high water mark in Major League Baseball. So, yeah, he was a true Hall of Famer, probably arguably the best pitcher ever. You could definitely make an argument for that. But the thing about Walter Johnson, he arrived in Washington in 1907. And his first 5 seasons, they finished last 2 times. They finished second to the last 3 times. But he still had a dream, which he always held on to. He had a dream to one day he hoped he could appear in the World Series and pitch a win in the World Series. So that was his career-long dream. In 1912, Washington baseball history changed forever. That's when the 7 members of the board of directors, they comprised the ownership group of the Senators, They hired a new manager. They wanted a winner, a manager who was a smart baseball man, had a good reputation. That was Clark Griffith. Clark Griffith came on board in 1912. He was given an incentive by the board of directors. They allowed him to buy into the baseball team, 10% stock into the team if he took the managerial job. That intrigued him. He came to Washington. His results were immediate. He had immediate success. In 1912, the Senators won 91 games. They won 90 the following season. They were contenders. Didn't win the pennant, but they were good. They were no longer a laughingstock. But it really helped Griffith a lot to have Walter Johnson in his prime. In 1912, Walter Johnson won 33 games, including 16 in a row. In 1913, he was 36-7. So he certainly was a great one, no doubt about it. Now, by the end of the decade, the Senators were back to their old ways. They finished 7th in 1919. So they went back to their old ways. Griffith had a vision to build a team on young ball players, including a guy like Bucky Harris. One day he scouted Bucky Harris playing in the minor leagues. Harris knew he was being scouted, but a few days before he broke a finger. But he knew Griffith was in the crowd, so he wanted to make an impression. He wanted to make it to the majors. So he played the game with the broken finger. He got 6 hits, handled all his fielding chances. That impressed Griffith to buy him. Griffith liked Harris from the beginning. He liked his tough disposition. He liked him that he was a hard-nosed ball player. He would tell Bucky Harris occasionally, one day I want you to manage the Senators. Of course, that happened sooner than he had expected. I'll get into that later. By 1919, Griffith became tired of the board of directors. They became tired of him. He decided that the only way he was going to ever win a pennant in Washington, get to the World Series, was to be in complete command. So he arranged a buyout of the board of directors in December of 1919. He got financial backing. He had a business partner. He became the team owner, co-owner, I should say. He owned half the team. And he continued to manage for one season. So he was now co-owner and manager. He managed for one season. Then he decided after the 1920 season he was going to turn it over to someone else. He would concentrate on the day-to-day operations of the ball club and other things and let someone else manage the team. Well, that turned out not to work out very well because for the next 3 seasons he went through a manager a year. He went through a manager a year for the next 3 seasons. And by the end of the 1923 season, he was looking for another manager. Now, my story on the 1924 baseball season actually begins on New Year's Eve, 1923. Bucky Harris, starting second baseman for the Senators, he went to a New Year's Eve party at the Warman Park Hotel. He was well-dressed for the occasion. He had a date for the occasion. He also had a black eye because he played semi-pro basketball. He had a game the day before in New York. That was, playing basketball was usually in his contract. It was prohibited. It was a heavy fine if he played basketball, if he was caught playing basketball and not focusing on baseball. However, his 1923 contract didn't have that. It didn't have anything against playing basketball. He knew it was an oversight. He took advantage. He liked playing basketball. He thought it was a great way to stay in shape for baseball season. So he signed up with a semi-pro team, sustained a black eye. Here he was at a New Year's Eve party. It was no problem. I mean, here I am in Washington, but Griffith's not going to be at this party, right? Well, no, he was right. Griffith was not at the party, but an executive from the front office was. So that executive saw Harris. Harris told him the story about the black eye. The executive told Griffith, so Harris was called on the floor the next day. And Griffith, he let him know how he felt. He thought, I was disappointed in you for doing this. It wasn't in the contract, but you shouldn't have done it. Harris admitted, yeah, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done this. I apologize. Griffith said, forget it. Then Griffith moved on to something different. He said, I'm going to send you down to Tampa where we spring train. That was their spring training site. I'm going to send you down to Tampa. It's a month before spring training. However, you look underweight. I want you to get a good rest before spring training. Well, Harris kind of knew better. Yeah, he's sending me down there because he wants to make sure I don't footloose again. So Harris, he obeyed orders. He went with the team trainer, Mike Martin. They went to Tampa. They traveled to Tampa, to get things ready for spring training and rest up. Meanwhile, Griffith, as he went back to work on other things, he got a letter from Walter Johnson. Walter Johnson told him that 1924 was going to be his last year in baseball. Well, Griffith didn't want to lose his best pitcher, but Walter Johnson wanted to move on to other things. Actually, Walter Johnson, he was now 36 years old. 1924 would be his 18th season in Major League Baseball. However, he had a sore arm. He sustained a sore arm during the 1920 spring of 1920, and he became a mediocre pitcher for the next 4 seasons. So he thought the time was right to retire, but he also wanted to do it for his family because, as he explained, it was an injustice to my children to make him live in Washington during the baseball season, then go to Kansas, Coffeyville, Kansas, his hometown, make him live there for half a year, and then go to Reno, where his wife was from. He wanted to just settle down in one place. He wanted to move to California, settle down with the kids, and let them do their schooling all year round in one place. So he thought that was in the best interest of his family. Meanwhile, back in Tampa, Bucky Harris and the trainer, Mike Martin, they were getting the field ready for spring training. They'd work on the field during the day. At nighttime, they'd sit on the porch at the old Tampa Bay Hotel, which was at one time considered one of the best hotels in the world. By the time it had lost that prestigious reputation, by the time the Senators were spring training there in the 1920s, it still stands. It's known for its silvery domes. It's known for its key-shaped doorways as well. But Bucky Harris and Mike Martin, they'd sit on the porch and they'd talk about the coming season, the Senators, and their biggest concern was who was going to manage the team. It was February now, and there was still not a manager in place. So who's going to manage the team in 1924? Harris was also wondering where he was going to play in 1924 because there were rumors that reached him. He knew about these rumors about Harris being traded to the New York Yankees. So one day, it was February 9th, just a few days before spring training was going to start. Still no manager for the Senators. No idea who's going to manage the team, right? So Harris was in his hotel room. He got a telegram from a Washington baseball fan who was very close to the team, very close to the Senators. The telegram had one word: congratulations. With nothing to go by, Harris thought, well, the congratulations can only mean one thing. I was traded to the New York Yankees, the world champions, Babe Ruth, right? Babe Ruth, they won the last 3 American League pennants. I'm going to the best team in baseball. Then another telegram came. Harris assumed that this was his reporting orders, everything he had to know about reporting to the Yankees. He opened up the telegram. It was from Griffith. He read the telegram. Then he began to shake. He began to tremble to the point where he had to sit down to regain his composure. Now, Harris later described that feeling. He wrote, I knew then how someone feels when they learn that a unknown relative left them a fortune. That's how Harris described the feeling. What did the telegram detail? Griffith offered him the Washington managerial job. A few minutes later, the telephone rang. Harris answered the phone. It was Griffith. Well, how do you feel about the matter? Griffith asked him. You want to manage the team? Harris, it was a no-brainer for him. Do I want to manage? Certainly. Then the phone went dead. Harris then shouted on the phone, yes, I want the job. No answer. So he hung up the phone. He ran down to the lobby. He went to the telegraph office, and he told someone to send a telegram. He told the operator, send this telegram. Here's a $20 bill. I want you to send it right away, and I want you to send it every hour for the next 4 hours, to make sure. Then Griffith wrote his note. Harris wrote a note. He said, yes, I want the job. Then he made a little practical joke. I'll take that job, and I'll win Washington's first pennant. Little did he know. Well, Harris was happy to learn that most of his players were older than he was. He was only 27 years old. Most of the players were for him. They were happy he got the job. I should say all the players were. However, the media, that was a different story. The media laughed at the decision. They called it Griffith's folly. A 27-year-old manager, second baseman manager, he's only 27 years old. There were plenty of player managers in baseball back then, but these guys were over 30 years old. They were seasoned veterans. Here's a guy, 27 years old, who only had 4 full seasons of playing experience. So most people thought, the writers felt a little sorry for Harris because Washington did not have a winning season the year before. They made no roster moves, so they assumed that Harris was being set to fail. One day, a West Coast sports writer, they asked Harris, Any chance this year? How you guys going to be? And Harris said, I think we're going to be good. I think we're going to have a contender. The sports writer then smiled. He said, I hear that every year, but you know what? By midseason, Washington is usually playing out their schedule. But Harris, in his heart, he really believed his team was going to be good. He talked championship to his team. He talked about contending. You know, he had a positive, upbeat attitude, and that rubbed off on his players. Opening day, the presidential opener, the president was on hand throughout the first pitch of the season. Opening day in Washington still is a big deal. As you know, it was a big deal back then. Behind Walter Johnson, the Senators beat the Philadelphia Athletics 4-0, so the season got off to a good start. However, it wouldn't be a sign of things to come in the early going. Washington actually got off to a slow start because it took time for Harris's enthusiasm to really rub in. And by mid-May, they were in second to last place. As for Washingtonians, you know, they weren't thinking too much about the Senators or baseball. That was the furthest thing from their mind, because in May of that year, Washington experienced one of its worst floods in city history. So the fans, you know, baseball became secondary to them at that point. The Senators had a homestand, as luck would have it. They had a 19 scheduled game homestand during that flooding, and they were able to get 12 games in. However, eventually the rain stopped. People got back to business, and the Senators got back to business. And in fact, the Senators actually got hot. When June came around, the Senators were playing very good baseball, moving up in the standings. And by the end of June, by mid-June actually, they had won 5 games in a row. They were up to third place. They were only 2 games behind the first place Yankees, and they were heading into New York to play the Yankees in a 4-game series. Meanwhile, in New York, when the team arrived in New York, Walter Johnson faced a group of New York sports writers, and he told them about his sore arm, which he injured in 1920. He actually said, as he described it, I caught a cold in my arm. Well, it's hard to imagine catching a cold in your arm, but what happened was he had a heavy cold, and when that cold finally evaporated, it left a knot. He said it left a knot in his pitching arm, and that affected his pitching, so he couldn't throw his fastball as effective as when he was in his prime. So that led to 4 mediocre seasons. However, through exercise, mostly hiking, Johnson restored his health and his strength in his legs. And not only that, he said, it's very funny, but it worked. You know, by strengthening my legs, that knot in my arm went away. So Walter Johnson was having a very good season in 1924. In fact, when they were in New York, his season record was 9-3. Meanwhile, the Senators swept the Yankees. They won all 4 games. So now they were in first place. Surprise. Here are the Senators actually in first place. Well, a New York sports writer was very impressed, and that's when he referenced the Library of Congress. He talked about the great triumphal chariot of Emperor Maximilian, which was in the gallery of etchings and prints that I had mentioned. His point was this. He said that he thought if Washington would hang on to and won the pennant, he thought that Walter Johnson would come to town in this triumphant chariot, come to town, you know, and everyone would wave to him, everyone would cheer him on. Here would be Walter Johnson, the Senators would be victorious, but he actually didn't think that, and like most writers, nobody really thought Washington would hang on. Well, Washington, after sweeping the Yankees, they came back home to a sellout crowd at Griffith Stadium. Before the game, big surprise, a dancing school called the Palmerton School of Dancing in Washington. They supplied some dance girls. They danced to the 7 Veils in front of the Dance of the 7 Veils in front of the Washington dugout. And Walter Johnson, the Senators, were very amused. According to one sports writer, they wore clothes that were nothing to write home on a postcard about. And then, according to the sports writer, they vanished as mysteriously as they arrived. Also on hand that day was the president, the first family. They saw the Senators take the Athletics. They saw Walter Johnson win. It was Walter Johnson's 10th win of the season, so he was having quite a season. The Senators remained red hot in June. They, by the end of June, they had won 17 of 19 games. By the end of June, they had a 3-game lead over the second-place New York Yankees. So things were looking very up for the Senators, but nobody really thought that they would hang on. And, you know, it was such a surprise. I mean, the Washington Senators in first place. One writer referenced this. He said, the Washington Senators in first place. People are waking up this morning, reading the newspaper and rubbing their eyes and wondering if they really are seeing what they're actually seeing, a Washington team in first place this late in the season. So the season now moved in July. The Yankees came in for a 5-game series. Here's Babe Ruth. He had a collision with the outfield wall, was knocked unconscious. By the way, I got this picture from the photos file in the Library of Congress. They have a lot of wonderful pictures about the Senators, the 1924 season, and this is one of them. Let me give you the story behind that. The night before, it was July 4th that evening, Bucky Harris had an idea. He thought if we could keep Babe Ruth out all night, keep him out all night long, he wouldn't be able to play in tomorrow's doubleheader, right? So he gave the assignment to Al Shack, one of the coaches, and he gave the assignment to Goose Goslin as well, an outfielder who was said to be a well-trained guide in partying. They took Babe Ruth out. They supplied him with champagne, and he drank it down like it was soda. And then they had a commitment the following morning as well. So they kept Babe Ruth out all night. When Al Shack and Goslin, when they arrived to the ballpark that day, they gave Harris the report, and he smiled. For sure that guy won't be able to play, right? Wrong. Babe Ruth, his first 3 times at the plate, he hit 3 doubles. Then, during that game, it was a doubleheader. During one of the games, he had the collision chasing a foul ball. He collided with the wall, dropped. He was knocked out. When he came to, his manager told him, "Why don't you sit out the rest of the day, Babe? Take the rest of the day off." Babe said, "No way, I'm staying in this game. I'm playing." And he did, and the Senators won both games. In fact, the Senators won 4 out of 5 games in that series and gained on the Senators. Next in the town was the other contending team, the Detroit Tigers, managed by Ty Cobb. Now, Ty Cobb, he was he was not only a great baseball player, but he tried to use psychology in his favor, and he did everything he could to intimidate Bucky Harris and the Washington Senators. He got into it with some of the fans as well. The Tigers took 3 out of 5. They knocked the Senators out of first place. However, the Senators rebounded. They stayed in contention. They started winning in later July. They were in second place behind their Yankees, but the good news was they were still in contention. So then came August. They began August with a trip to St. Louis. Now, if you know anything about the history of St. Louis baseball, one of the things that you'll know is during an era when you only played day baseball, it was notorious for its heat. And when the Senators arrived there, it was hot. One writer said it was so hot that the Washington Senators, their hotel rooms were like ovens. It was so hot that Bucky Harris canceled pregame batting practice and fielding practice. The Senators lost all 5 games. They dropped into third place. It didn't look good now. It was now mid-August. They were in third place. However, they rebounded. And in the end of August, they won 8 straight games. They were still in contention. They were in second place when here came the New York Yankees. A big series. It was at Yankee Stadium against the Yankees. Washington came to New York. They were 1.5 games behind the first place Yankees. They were 1.5 games behind those damn Yankees. Meanwhile, Walter Johnson was doing great. He was having a great season. He had not lost a game since July 11th, and he beat the Yankees in his start. And that win, when he beat the Yankees, that made his season record 18-6. Not only that, it was his 8th straight win. He had his winning streak where he won 16 games in 1912. Now he was approaching that. So he had won 8 in a row. The Senators took 3 out of 4 games. They were now in first place. They're back in first place. They returned to Washington for the last 5 home games of their season. There are more games. They had more games. They finished the season on the road, but their last 5 games were played, before the road trip at home. They closed out their home schedule by winning 4 out of 5 games. Walter Johnson won his start, his 9th straight win. So then the Senators would hit the road. They played their final 20 games on the road in 6 different cities. So that would be a lot of travel. Before leaving, they were invited by President Coolidge to the White House. They had a White House visit. Coolidge, who really didn't know anything about baseball, knew nothing about sports. His wife was the big sports fan. Grace Coolidge was a huge fan, a huge Senators fan. She followed the team when she went to the game. She kept the scorecard. She was the big baseball fan. She kept track of the team when it was on the road, followed their season. She was the big sports fan. However, Coolidge took an interest, and he said, I predict the Senators will come back from the road trip as American League champions. Of course, people knew, well, he probably doesn't really know, but his wife's probably telling him this. But so the Senators were now on the road. They went on the road. They started off in Philadelphia. This you see is a crowd in Washington. They're watching an electric scoreboard. Now, back in those days when your team was on the road, there were a few ways you could follow your team. There was no television back then, but there was radio. However, radio wasn't a play-by-play broadcast like today. It was more like a batter-by-batter description. Kind of dull, but that was the way you could follow your team. Most people went by the newspapers. They read the newspapers. That seemed to be the best way to follow your team. But an electronic scoreboard was another way. Here's what an electronic scoreboard looked like when the Senators were playing in Philadelphia. It was the play-by-play was given by light bulb signals. You could see this game. You see the pitcher for Washington that day is Walter Johnson. He pitched against Philadelphia. He beat Philadelphia. That was his 10th straight win and his 20th of the season. It was his first 20-win season since 1919. So now the Senators, the next stop was Detroit. When they got to Detroit, Walter Johnson got some great news. He was voted as the American League's most valuable player. They did it before the end of the season, not like today where they wait till after the season. So he won the American League Most Valuable Player Award. Then he beat the Tigers. He chalked up another win to his win streak, to his season record. The team then went to Cleveland, St. Louis, and then Chicago. In Chicago, Walter won again. It was his 13th straight win. He now had 23 for the season. The Senators, they swept the White Sox. They had left. When they left for this road trip, they were 2 games ahead of the Yankees. Now they were heading to Boston for the final 4 games of the season. They were still 2 games ahead of the Yankees. With 4 games left, 2 wins. They needed 2 wins to win the pennant. Well, the first game in Boston, Walter Johnson pitched, and he lost. So that was the end of his winning streak. So they lost the first game. They bounced back the next day, and they won. They beat the Red Sox. So now they're 1 game away from clinching the pennant. September 29th, 1924. 2 games left in the season. Washington, they scored in the first inning, and they held on to the lead. Meanwhile, back in Washington, it was raining, but it didn't stop the fans. The fans camped out at those electronic scoreboards. They watched in the rain. They had their umbrellas and other covering, but it was very uncomfortable, but they watched. And when the last out was made and Washington clinched the pennant, they celebrated. And I thought in a very moving compliment, one elderly old man told his elderly friend, he said, well, George, we lived to see the day. We lived to see Washington do it. So now it was on to the World Series. They would play against the New York Giants in the World Series. They were underdog because the Giants were a more experienced team. But before the World Series, after Washington returned home from beating the Red Sox, there was a parade. 100,000 people came out to celebrate Washington's victory to win the pennant. And we're now heading to the World Series. And President Coolidge was out there as well to celebrate. And it was now time for the World Series. Walter Johnson now had a chance to live his dream, winning a World Series game. He was ready. He was going to be the pitcher in Game 1 of the 1924 World Series against the Giants. Most people thought the Giants would win, but they thought at least Walter will get to live his dream. He'll get to pitch a win in the World Series. Meanwhile, before the World Series, Johnson received letters and telegrams from not only all 4 corners of the United States, but from all over the world. Everyone was pulling for the Senators, for Walter Johnson. Everyone wanted to see him win. So Johnson took it upon himself. His dream to win a World Series for himself is now secondary. He wanted to win for all these fans, for sure. So Game 1 of the 1924 World Series went 12 innings. Unfortunately, Walter Johnson lost 4-3. He pitched all 12 innings. Not only did he pitch all 12 innings, they had pitch counts back then, but they didn't hold pitchers to pitch counts like they do today. Walter Johnson threw 165 pitches, if you can imagine. 165 pitches. He was disappointed he didn't win, but he kept his spirit up. He said, I'll get another chance in the World Series to pitch. So I hope I get that chance, and, hopefully I'll win. Washington bounced back. They won Game 2 in Washington. Then the series for the next 3 games moved to New York, to the Polo Grounds. They split the next 2 games. So now the series was tied 2-2, heading to Game 5. And the starting pitcher for Game 5 was going to be Walter Johnson, another chance. Now the pressure was really on Walter Johnson, and yes, he felt it, because Game 6 was scheduled for the next day. Game 7 was the day after. So Game 5, there's no way Walter Johnson would pitch the next day, and he certainly wouldn't pitch in Game 7 on 1 day's rest. So this was it for Walter Johnson. And throughout that morning, he was with his wife, and he kept telling her, I have to win. I absolutely have to win. I have to win. Well, unfortunately, Walter Johnson didn't win. He lost, and nobody was more disappointed than Walter Johnson. After the game, he faced the sports writers. He showed them a box of telegrams he received from all over the world, all over the country. He read a few of those telegrams, including one from a couple in Alexandria, Virginia, who named their firstborn in his honor. Then he held up the telegrams and he said to the writers with disappointed, these make me feel even worse. I had 2 chances to win and I didn't come through. I'm going to retire at the end of the season. I'll go down in history as I'll finish my career with 2 World Series losses. The series now moved back to Washington for Game 6 and Game 7 if needed. And when the Senators, when they boarded the train, Walter Johnson had big tears in his eyes. He was heartbroken. He really wanted to win, and now, it looked like the Giants had their best pitcher going in Game 6. So it looked like the Giants would win in 6 games, and, that would be that, and the Senators would lose. However, in Game 6, Bucky Harris delivered a big hit that drove in 2 runs, and Tom Zachary, the starting pitcher, pitched the game of his life. They beat the Giants and their best pitcher, Art Neff. They beat them 2-1. So there would be a Game 7. The next day, Game 7, Bucky Harris homered to give Washington a 1-0 lead. So things were looking good. They were off to a good start. They were up 1-0. But in one of the middle innings, the Giants scored 3 times. So now the score was 3-1 Giants. It looked like they were on their way to victory. In the 8th inning, however, Bucky Harris delivered another big hit, and the Senators rallied and scored 2 more runs. So now the game was tied 3-3 heading into the 9th inning, Game 7, 3-3 tie. Now the fans knew, everybody knew who was following the game, watching the electric scoreboards, listening to the radio at the game. Everybody knew that Washington during that rally had sent up a pinch hitter for their pitcher. That meant a new pitcher would be on the mound in the top of the 9th. And who was on the mound for the top of the 9th? Walter Johnson. Another chance to get that World Series win he always dreamed about. Another chance to win for Washington. Another chance to win for all those fans who poured in their support from all over the country and around the world. Well, Johnson in the top of the 9th, he got into a jam, so it didn't look good. However, he worked his way out of the jam without allowing the run. In the 10th inning, he got into another jam, but worked his way out of it. He pitched through the 10th inning. He pitched through the 11th and the 12th inning. So now the game headed into the bottom of the 12th. By this time, you can imagine the Washington fans were on the brink of exhaustion by this time. In the bottom of the 12th, the Senators, they put 2 men on base. They had runners on first and second, only 1 out. A rookie named Earl McNeely was at the plate. He hit a ground ball, a routine ground ball toward the third baseman. It looked like it would result in an inning-ending double play. However, that crowd was on Washington's side because that ball mysteriously took a high hop over the third baseman, rolled into left field, allowed the runner on second to round third and score the winning run. The Washington Senators won the World Series. That's a picture. Here's this picture. You can see Muddy Rule about to score the winning run. Earl McNeely, the guy who got the base hit, had just rounded first base. Washington won the World Series. Walter Johnson, best of all, Walter Johnson was the winning pitcher. So as you can imagine, yeah, Walter Johnson did it. And everybody was happy for him. The Washington Senators were world champions. It was the only time in Washington Senators history that they were world champions. And just one more note about Walter Johnson, he would be back in 1925. In fact, he'd be back for 3 more seasons before retiring. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's a great story.
Okay. Going to open it up to a little Q&A here. Anyone have any questions? Walter Johnson.
So Bucky Harris was a player manager?
Bucky Harris, right, was 27 years old, second baseman, player manager. Player managers were common. You know, Ty Cobb was a player manager. George Sisler, Hall of Fame first baseman for the St. Louis Browns, was a player manager. So there were plenty of player managers in that era. However, not many were that young. You know, Bucky Harris only 27 years old, and you know, they were actually, you know, after Bucky Harris in 1933, Griffith hired another player manager, Joe Cronin, 26 years old, managed the Senators in 1933 and played shortstop, and they won the pennant that year in 1933. So his player manager theme, young player manager theme, worked a couple times.
Did Johnson actually ever manage the team?
Yeah, he did. He did. He wanted to manage after his playing career. After 1924, he decided that he was going to settle his family in Washington. He bought a house in Bethesda, which still stands, and he pitched 3 more seasons, and he wanted to manage the Senators. So he managed the minors for 1 year, and then in 1929, Griffith made a managerial change. You know, Bucky Harris's magic was great for 2 years. They won the World Series in 1924. They won the pennant and went back to the World Series in 1925. But by this time, it had worn off. So Johnson became their manager in 1929, and he managed the team through the 1932 season.
Memory serves as like a newsreel of the 1920s?
Yeah, in fact, Malia was telling me about that. We were talking about that earlier. Yeah, it was discovered a few years ago. They didn't even realize they had it here in the Library of Congress. But yeah, you can see it on YouTube. They show that Game 7, Walter Johnson pitching that game-winning run. You know, you could see it all on that newsreel. It's on YouTube. You can watch it anytime. Yeah.
Games were played at Griffith Stadium?
Games 1 and 2 were at Griffith Stadium, and games 6 and 7. Games 3, 4, and 5 were at the Polo Grounds in New York.
This is just baseball sicko question. What was Game 7? What was the game log on top of the ninth, top of the 10th? You said he got into a jam. Was it? Did he walk?
Yeah, well, it was the game log in the top of the 9th and the top of the 10th for Walter Johnson. In the top of the 9th, he retired the first batter, and then Frank Frisch, Hall of Fame second baseman for the Giants, he hit a triple. He hit one into the gap, and the catcher, Muddy Rule, it was the catcher, Muddy Rule, he was watching that ball roll into the gap, you know, in the outfield, and he said, in his opinion, it looked like the ball would never stop rolling. It just kept rolling and rolling. But the outfielder retrieved the ball. They got it back to the infield, and they held Frisch to a triple. Then they intentionally walked the next batter, and then Johnson retired the next 2 batters to get out.
First and third, and then he retired all 3.
Then he retired. Yeah, he got the first out before the triple, so it was first and third with 2 outs or with 1 out, and then he retired them and got out of the jam. And then the 10th inning, he either walked or he gave up another hit, but he had runners on base, and I believe he got a double play. I know in one of the innings he got a double play to get out of the inning. And the good thing about that double play is the ball was hit right back to Johnson, so he got to participate in the. He was a pretty good fielder. Yeah, he was good in everything. He was actually an outstanding hitter, especially for a pitcher. He's a good athlete. Any other questions?
What resources at the library were most helpful when you were writing your book?
What resources at the library were most helpful in writing the book? No doubt the microfilm. And I used 4 Washington newspapers, the Post, the Washington Herald, the Washington Times, and the Washington Star. I looked at all 4 of them. And, you know, the beauty about the Library of Congress, what I really love about the Library of Congress, if there's something you want to know more about, you see something in the Washington newspapers, you think, well, I wonder what the out-of-town newspapers, what did the New York or Philadelphia, what did their writers say about this player, this specific at-bat or whatever. So I was able to do that. I really enjoy having that. That's a lot to do. And because you have, the only drawback is because you have so many good resources here, is you tend to over-research. I over-research for sure, no doubt about it. But hey, it's great.
Did Povich cover
Did Shirley Povich, the Hall of Fame sports writer who was in Washington, did he cover the World Series? No, he didn't. He just started that year. He was still a few years away. However, he worked for the Washington Post, and he wrote a few articles. And his first article, when Washington beat the Yankees when they swept them 4 straight at New York back in June, Povich was on hand. There was a big reception at Union Station for the team, and Povich was on hand to cover that reception, and he wrote about that, and that was his first article in the Washington Post. That was his first article, so he's a Sun-Times writer, but he took a lot of pride in that article, and he kept the plate for that article. He had it his whole life. That was a great moment for him. Any other questions? Got another one?
I can't get over it. So, did he lose because the Polo Grounds is like a horrible place to pitch, basically? Like,
I think he lost because he was tired. You know, he threw 165 pitches in game one. Yeah, you can imagine he was exhausted, and you know, it was a close game. It was 3-2 heading into the bottom of the eighth, and then he began to show is where the sports writers noticed that you know, the way he was pitching and fielding. I mean, he was definitely tired, and he gave way to 3 runs in the bottom of the eighth and ended up losing 6-2. So.
And he never figured out that, like, with Koufax, we knew it's a Tommy John, right? Like, that's just understood.
Yeah.
Nobody ever figured out what the arm fatigue or whatever was.
Yeah, the question is, nobody ever figured out the arm fatigue for Walter Johnson. Now, nobody for sure. Walter Johnson assumed and always said it was something caused from the heavy cold he had in the spring of 1920. He said he thought it was due to that. I don't know, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know, but you know, it stuck with him for 4 years, and you know, in 1924 it was gone. You know, it surprised him that it was gone, but you know, he certainly was happy about that, and he turned in a great season, no doubt about it.
Do you have any idea what a fastball speed was?
I had a feeling I would get this question. Was how fast was Walter Johnson's fastball? Nobody knows for sure because they didn't time it back then. There's been assumptions, you know, about how fast he really threw. You know, the only assumptions, though nobody could tell for sure. However, back in the late 1930s, Walter Johnson watched Bob Feller, who's another pitcher with a blazing fastball, Hall of Fame pitcher. He watched him pitch one day in Washington, and he was asked, "Were you that fast?" And Walter Johnson said, "Yeah, to be honest, I was faster than Feller." Feller was timed at something like 96.4 miles an hour. So if Johnson was faster, he may have thrown, who knows, maybe 100 miles an hour. But he had a blazing fastball, and it was pretty much the only pitch he had. He had a curveball, but he only had an average curveball, and it took him 6 seasons to develop that curveball. So he was pretty much solely a fastball pitcher.
Seeing the videos of him pitching, the sidearm delivery
Yeah.
is really striking. Pitching at his speed. Was sidearm pitching very
Yeah, the question is about Walter Johnson's pitching style, about his sidearm. He had a sidearm motion. Was that common? A lot of pitchers did throw sidearm back then, but Johnson had kind of a different kind of motion, different kind of pitch. It was kind of like a corkscrew, and the way he threw the ball was almost like someone trying to skip a rock along the water. You know, he had a very different motion, but very powerful. You know, very powerful pitch, fastball pitcher. So, you know, there were a lot of sidearm pitchers back then, but you know, Walter Johnson's style was definitely different from anyone else's.
Is there a comparison to a modern motion pro? Is it like Randy Johnson, who's also on your side?
Yeah, is there a comparison? Not maybe in comparison to a fastball, but not to his pitching style. I can't think of anybody. There's a question back here.
I've heard or read something about his right arm was longer than his left arm.
Yeah, the question is about Walter Johnson's arm length. Was it longer than most people, or was it longer than his left arm? I don't know if it was longer than his left arm, but I know he had very long arms. In fact, when Johnson made his debut, you know, his major league debut in 1907 against the Tigers, it was against the Tigers. And one thing that Ty Cobb always recalled was when he met Walter Johnson, saw him for the first time, you know, he laughed because, you know, Walter Johnson was from the country, and he had like really long arms that seemed to be longer than normal, you know. So, you know, the Tigers teased him about that. You know, they gave him a hard time about his arms and about just his pitching style and just, you know, being a kid and everything. But when Walter Johnson took the mound and he released his first pitch, a blazing fastball, the laughter quickly stopped.
Cobb
Cobb said, what did Cobb say? Cobb said something about, well, first he said,
Something hissed behind me.
yeah, hissing with danger is what got, yeah. But I also like the way Cobb introduces, before he said that, the way he introduces Johnson in his book. He said, yeah, the Washington manager found a real hayseed to pitch against us. Yeah. All right. Well, once again, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it.